In my consulting business, I've had many opportunities to work with some really dynamic trainers. And one of those is Greg Nielsen of Nielsen Consulting. Greg's been doing some very innovative things within the strategic planning field. And so I asked him to join me for a conversation about the trends that he is seeing within strategic planning, and especially the priorities that need to be in place during strategic planning during a crisis. So I hope that you enjoy this conversation with Greg Nielsen. Greg, thank you so much for joining me today. Would you tell me a little bit about the nonprofit consulting group that you are working with and what you're doing?
It is my pleasure, Ginny. It's great to be with you today. I am the president and CEO of Nielsen Training and Consulting. So I work with nonprofit organizations all across the country, and I focus my efforts in three areas. I focus on board excellence. So what do we need to do to build dynamic, effective, healthy board teams, strategic planning, and organizational development. So those are the three areas
Okay.
I work in and am privileged to interact with so many phenomenal organizations across the country.
Excellent. Do you focus on any specific size organizations, or really is it just a large range that you're?
I have worked with one-person shows. I have worked with international organizations that have hundreds of staff members. My heart and soul have always been with the small to medium-sized nonprofits, just because that was my background. When I was a nonprofit CEO, I led two different organizations, both of which would fall into that small to medium-sized category. So that's where I cut my teeth, and so that's always been where my heart is.
Okay, that's good. That's also mine. I love the small to medium sized nonprofit. I think they still don't have the limitations of large bureaucracy, and they can think big without having too many screens in front of their faces. So
Yes,
you do some strategic planning with nonprofits,
I do.
and the strategic planning world is changing in so many ways because all those strategic plans we had post March 2020 are now looking like they might be not the direction that nonprofits need to go. So I wanted to have you on today to talk to me a little bit about strategic planning and how it changes during crisis. My thoughts were maybe you could explain what your standard approach to strategic planning looks like, and then maybe how that has changed in the world of pandemic world we live in.
So I always start with strategic planning, and you can ask a group, how many of you have had an absolutely horrible experience with strategic planning? A lot of times you will ask a board that question because the first thing to understand is that strategic planning does not have to be like going to the dentist. Right? A lot of times when we talk to nonprofit leaders and we talk to boards, their image, their experience of strategic planning has been oh my gosh, this is going to take 12 to 18 months. We are going to have meeting after meeting after meeting, and it's going to be like pulling teeth. And
Right.
instead, what we know about strategic planning is it should be a dynamic and enjoyable process. The goal of strategic planning is to make really important, big, bold decisions about the direction of your organization. And if I am passionate about the mission of this organization as an executive director or as a board member, that should be exciting to me. And the process should match that excitement and bring out that excitement and be designed intentionally to tap into those feelings rather than being a slog through the mud.
Mm-hmm,
Right.
mm-hmm.
So the first thing about strategic planning, particularly in a time of crisis when you know that decisions are weighty and you know that decisions have real consequence, is let's make sure that the process is enjoyable. Let's make sure that nothing in the process itself interferes with our ability to be engaged in the work and in the tough choices that we have. So what have I seen during the pandemic? If anything, I have seen a focus, even more of a laser focus on the importance of strategy. Right?
Okay.
Some organizations have, the temptation or the thought was strategy may lapse during this time because we're focusing on more immediate needs. Instead, savvy organizations are saying strategy is more important now than ever because the
Excellent.
consequences may be greater now than they ever have been. If I have seen one trend, it has been towards a shorter term. of a
Okay.
strategic plan. So, back when I started in this business 10 plus years ago, it wasn't at all uncommon to see 5 and 10-year
Yes.
strategic plans. Do you remember the 10-year
Yes. Oh,
strategic
yes.
plan? Oh my goodness. Now, that shifted down to 3 years at first. Now, if I've seen any trend in the pandemic environment, has been even a shortening of that. So I'm
Yeah.
doing a lot more 18 to 24 month strategic plans that are laser focused and highly relevant to the needs of the organization during the pandemic. Right.
Okay.
So we're not trying to look 3 and 4 years down the road, because who the heck knows what that's going to look like. But
Right.
we know
Yeah.
that we can focus on 18 to 24 months. That allows us to be tighter on our timeframes, allows us to hold ourselves accountable to specific goals and tactics a little bit more,
Yeah.
and be more focused.
And I was going to say, it might actually give you quite a bit of flexibility for the organization. So as things develop even further, where they're able to react better than maybe the situation they're currently in, where they've got a 5-year plan in place that doesn't in any way relate to what's going on.
Here's a fun story for you, and this is
Okay.
something that I always noticed, is when you were doing a 3 to 5 year strategic plan, right? The temptation for the board is everything that was someone's idea on the board that they thought was a good idea but wasn't really a priority. We stuck it in the strategic plan and we just said, we'll do that in year 3 and 4,
Right.
right? When
Right.
we shorten
Much
that time
nicer.
frame.
Yeah.
Yes, when we shorten that time frame to 18 to 24 to 36 months, that puts some pressure on us as a
Okay.
board and a staff team. We're holding ourselves accountable to that because that's a horizon that's going to occur within my term as a board member. And so if we're putting that in the plan, we know that we're going to hold ourselves accountable to that. It's not just fluff. And so it's been an opportunity to focus the strategic plan on items that are of real priority within the horizon of the organization.
Okay. So I'm seeing with a number of my clients, there is some inability to dream big. And I'm wondering if during your strategic planning, especially in this kind of reduced, time period, for future planning, are you having them dream big, or are you really having them kind of focus in and trying to just draw out those individual goals that are kind of the minimum to achieve the mission? Like, what is your approach?
I think that's a phenomenal observation, because I've seen that as well. It's a natural human nature, right? It's our tendency of when we're in a crisis situation is to circle the wagons, right? Is to kind of go into a shell. That's not optimal for strategy, though. It's harder to make decisions when we have tunnel vision and we have those blinders on. And so the first thing that I would say to nonprofit organizations is make sure that in your strategic planning process, you're getting outside the walls of the organization, meaning you're still doing a landscape assessment. You're still understanding the ecosystem of the organization. What's happening outside our walls that is going to impact our strategy? What do our customers, our consumers, our stakeholders, what are they missing from us? What do they want to see more of from us? So again, we don't get that when we just go internal, when we just bring the board and the staff into a conference room and say, go, produce a strategic plan by the end of the day, right? A thoughtful strategic planning process is one that has a discovery phase where we're going outside the walls of the organization to see what might we not have visibility into right now. And that's a really good way to get an organization out of its own head, to think a little bit more broadly, to think a little bit more boldly.
To think about the opportunities that may be available to them, that they can't see because they're so caught up in the current limitations and the crisis. That's actually a great topic that you brought up in dealing with surveying the stakeholders and surveying the community, which really owns that nonprofit. But stakeholders themselves are in crisis, right? So have you seen a limited response from stakeholders when you're trying to engage them in this process? What are you seeing in regards to being able to assess stakeholder thoughts around the mission of the organizations for strategic planning?
Believe it or not, I've seen exactly the opposite. I've seen a greater involvement from stakeholders in things like surveys. And part of it is the fact that we are finally open to more virtual tools, right? So for years, when we thought about strategic planning, we thought about an in-person focus group, or we thought about, gathering people face to face. Well, now we're thinking more broadly. We're thinking, can we send out surveys use a SurveyMonkey or a
Mhm.
Google Forms or
Mhm.
something else? Can we do our focus groups online through Zoom?
Mhm.
That's ways to drive greater engagement. So if anything, I'm seeing more engagement from stakeholders. And one of my favorite questions to ask as part of this discovery phase, and it goes right to your point of how do we dream a little bit bigger and a little bit bolder, is from your perspective as a stakeholder in the community, what is the most significant unmet need for you that our organization should be fulfilling? Right?
Okay.
What is the most significant unmet need that you have that's appropriate for us as an organization
That's a
to
great
be fulfilling?
question. Great
That's a
question.
way for us as an organization to see what need are we not filling for those who are important to us, those who are
Okay.
customers, those who are our consumers. What are we not doing for them?
You might get some answers you don't want.
You
You
have to
may
set,
be.
you do have to,
Woo!
you also have to apply a filter, because sometimes you may get answers and go, oh my goodness, we would never want to do that, or we could never do that. But
But
it
even
does
then,
get you outside.
well, and I was going to say, even then, those answers might reflect a bigger issue with how you're viewed and the perception of your organization and the community, what your role is and your mission, and it might be another whole topic for the strategic plan that you didn't know you had.
It goes back to, I think it was Steve Jobs and Apple, when they were
Mhm.
putting together the iPod, right?
Yeah,
It wasn't about giving you something that you needed as a consumer. It was about giving you something that you didn't even realize you needed. So
that's
again,
right.
it's that opportunity for a nonprofit organization in strategic planning to be on the cutting edge, to be ahead of the curve, to be ahead of any other competitors that they have in the community in thinking through what are some creative, bold, courageous ways that we could be addressing our mission.
Yeah, that's great. I think you've been reading Sinek's Start With Why. Have you read that? When
I
Jobs, he
have.
talks all about Jobs and Apple and the whole purpose behind I love that book.
Yes.
I'm a preacher about that book.
Okay.
Um, so tell me, when you're going into the strategic planning process, I mean, I know the mistakes that I've seen made, and I mean, one being you don't ask the stakeholders at all, so that's a huge issue. What are some other problems that or other big mistakes that nonprofits make in the strategic planning process?
The never-ending process. That's the
Yeah,
one. That
more
is my
meetings.
that is my least favorite when I was a nonprofit executive. It is certainly my least favorite now as a consultant. I think one of the most important decisions a nonprofit organization can make going into strategic planning is over what time period can we commit to getting this plan accomplished, right? So if we want to do it, I think for most organizations, a good strategic plan can be done in 90 to 120 days. Right? I
Okay.
think that allows for a thoughtful process. It allows for engagement, and it allows for us to know what the end date is at the end, right? So I think that never-ending process of, okay, we're starting strategic planning and we'll finish when we finish. I think that's a huge mistake.
Okay.
Number one, it drags on forever. Right? It's
Yes.
always going to be something that drags on forever in that situation. And number two, the landscape is changing so fast that
Right.
if we try to create our strategic plan and it drags out over 12 months, well, guess what? The way our landscape looks at the end of those 12 months may be fundamentally different than the way it looked when we started. And we're in that perpetual state of reinventing ourselves through the strategic plan.
Yeah,
So I
you
think
just
a
have to do it
limited
all again.
process. Yeah. So I
Okay.
would I would highly encourage organizations, especially if they're approaching a facilitator or a consultant, to say, we expect to be able to start this process on January 1. We would like to finish by March 31 and have it be ready for approval.
Okay. Yeah. Are there what about unrealistic goals, or maybe goals that are not supported adequately with either time or staff or money? What are your thoughts around that? Like, how do you help your clients think about that?
It's important for every goal that we set as an organization for us to identify what does success look like in that goal. So number one, what is the definition of success?
Makes
And
sense.
number two, what resources will be necessary to reach that definition of success? So it's
Okay.
not just, okay, our organization is going to go from serving 1,000 kids to serving 5,000 kids, or serving 100 people to serving 10,000 people, right? It's what does that look like? Over what time period? Who's going to lead that that effort, who's going to support that effort, and what resources, both tangible and intangible, meaning money, as well as other types of resources, do we need to get there? The more we can develop that in the strategic planning process, we then all have a realistic definition of success, and no one can claim that they didn't have a level of ownership in the co-creation of that goal. So as a board member, if I'm going to be asked to fundraise to support the strategic plan, I know that up front. And my executive director can pinpoint, okay, remember area of focus number 1, where we said we wanted to revamp the technology in the organization and it was going to require this. That's why I'm asking you to fundraise. That's why this is necessary. It goes back to your start with the why.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that investment and that commitment. Even then, getting that board buy-in and volunteer buy-in that you need so much for your staff to be able to do what they do so well. And I think that's a really interesting point that you brought up, because so many organizations create these strategic plans and they say things like, we are going to be the #1 organization in 3 years. We're going to be the #1 organization across the entire South, and they don't even serve anyone in the South yet. And then they don't have any resources committed to doing that, even if they did, or a board that's invested and committed to it. But big dreams, right?
It goes back to, and this is part of the board work I do as well, it goes back to putting people in a position to be successful.
Yeah.
Right? That's what a strategic plan is you're setting up expectations, you're charting a course for the organization, but you want it to be a course that puts both board, executive, staff members in a position to be successful. And if I'm not committing the resources, or if I don't know what the path looks like to achieve that goal, I've not put my board or my staff or my executive in a position to be successful. And ultimately, how do I hold people accountable if I've not put them in a position to be successful?
Yeah, great point. Excellent. Let's see. So I know that there are some key aspects to developing the planning process. And of course, not wanting the planning process to go on forever. What are some really key elements to the day of planning, right? We've got all the things leading up to getting us to that day. Because of course, clients want to just do the day, like you said.
Yes.
What are all those things, or 2 days? What are all those things leading up to that? Or what are those kind of concrete key elements leading up to that? Obviously, community stakeholder assessment. What else would be involved?
Roles, a really concrete understanding of who is playing what role and what am I being asked for as a board member who's participating in the strategic planning process. So if there's a strategic planning committee that's going to be writing the plan, or the executive director, be clear about that's what their role is. If the board's role is to provide insight, wisdom, kind of fact check, be clear about what you're asking of people during that planning day. Process, make sure everyone understands before they leave the room on that day what happens next. Right? So if I'm a board member and I'm super energized, I just participated in 8 hours of planning and I'm leaving thinking, whoo, I just gave a whole lot of great ideas. What happens next? Do we all in the room understand what is going to be done with that information after we walk out? And then preparation, preparation, preparation. If we only have 1 day together, let's make sure we're thoughtful in planning the agenda, realistic in planning the agenda, and let's make sure that before we get to any planning, we're presenting some of that discovery data so that everybody is on the same page. And if I'm a board member who hasn't been at the board meeting for the last 6 months and I didn't read any of the data prior to that, guess what? I really don't want that board member charting my next course for the 3 years of the organization. We want everybody to be on the same page. We want everybody to be prepared, understand their role, understand what the process looks like.
Okay. So do you have your board or the boards do self-assessments prior to, so that they have an understanding of how they're performing in their role? Or does that come into account maybe only in certain organizations and not in others?
Occasionally. So in an ideal world, I would love it if every board assessed their performance before they even embarked on strategic planning, right? Because we want a healthy, well-functioning, highly performing team to be the one that is setting strategy for the organization. If there are dysfunctions or conflicts, we want to address those before we do strategic planning. We don't want them to pop up in the middle of our planning meetings. Right? So in an ideal world, I would love it if every organization would make that investment. Unfortunately, that's either not realistic or feasible in the resource limitations that they
Right.
have often, but it is something that I encourage quite often for
Right.
organizations. And I
Well,
don't ever think it's a bad idea.
if they're doing it annually, which they should be
Yes,
in best practice, then maybe you can utilize the tools from the previous self-assessment
true.
if they do that. Let's see. So are you seeing any specific subject areas? And obviously, I'm thinking immediately about like real estate and the changes in real estate for these strategic plans and how they're going to house their staff or serve their clients physically. So in addition to that topic, if you're seeing that, are you seeing any other topics that are very specifically being addressed consistently by boards right now?
I think you hit one right on the head with real estate. I think that fundamentally, and this transcends nonprofit and for-profit sector,
Yeah.
I think all small businesses are reevaluating their space needs. Meaning, do we need a physical office? Do we need a physical clinic? What is the nature of our mission and what are the space needs for that? And I think strategic planning is really well suited to articulate that. Because if you look at what is your strategy, you can then align the different components of that. So if our strategy is to do X, what type of physical space matches that mission? Right? And is it the same as what we have now, or is it somehow different? So I think that's a great one that has come up frequently. The others that I see coming up often are earned revenue. So when we think about sustainability, organizations that are thinking about it broadly than just their philanthropic bases of support, that are thinking, what are our current earned revenue streams? How are they performing? How have they been impacted during the pandemic? So if I'm an arts organization and my theater or museum has been closed for the last 6 months, that's going to have a direct bearing on my strategy coming up. So again, thinking through earned revenue streams and what that means for sustainability. The one that doesn't get talked about enough, but has come up repeatedly in strategic plans recently, and I'm thrilled that it has, is succession planning. Meaning, how much risk exposure do we have right now to the loss of a key leader? Whether it is a board officer, president, vice president, an executive director, CEO, chief development officer, how have we mitigated our risk and how have we protected the interests of the organization so that we're not vulnerable to the loss, either sudden or less sudden, of a key leader within the organization? So I've seen that come up a lot. I don't know if maybe the pandemic has raised some of those questions for organizations, but I've been thrilled to see that as a part of recent strategic plans.
That's such an interesting idea, because I have seen such significant turnover on boards and staff. Even with the economy heading the way it is and that job market, you still are seeing tremendous retention issues on boards and staff because they have other priorities, right? And they have to if you've got kids at home that you're homeschooling, you no longer can work a full-time job. And so it's really interesting that that's what's brought it to the forefront more than likely. But what an important issue and topic, especially now, for
what I love the most, Ginny, is that the conversation has become more nuanced and more sophisticated. So in previous strategic plans in past years, you would hear a lot of the tried and true, what happens if the bus hits the executive director, right? And that's how we thought about succession. Now organizations are thinking about it from a much more nuanced and sophisticated view, meaning, what if our executive director has to step away for 3 months? What if a key leader in the organization can't be face-to-face with our donor base for a period of time? What if a board officer isn't able to discharge their duties for a period of time? How are we going to manage that transition of power? How are we going to share power throughout the organization? I think that's a much more sophisticated way to look at those questions rather than just the executive director is here one day and gone the next.
It'll happen. Yes. It's a much more realistic approach, and maybe we've all become a little bit more accepting that things can happen that are way beyond our control. And
it also, frankly, opens the door to some more important questions about equity within the organization. So
Okay.
it gives the executive an opportunity to have a conversation with the board around the equity practices throughout the organization. What does that look like in our work from home policies, our virtual
Mm-hmm.
policies?
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like in access to technology? Do we
Mm-hmm.
have staff members who are equipped and put in position to be successful? So you can see how it's not just succession. It's not just, okay, if the executive director is here one day and gone the next, this is what our hiring practice is going to be. It's a more important and sophisticated conversation around how do we make sure that all of the practices within the organization are aligned with our core values, and that we're maintaining a sense of equity throughout the organization and reflecting our values through the practices and sustainability that we espouse.
Wow, I mean that's taking that to such another level. I don't think that many organizations and leaders have really probably thought about or given much thought to this before now, because we can create that space in our office,
Yes.
but creating it beyond our walls, how do we do that and ensure that equity exists? That's really great to hear that those conversations are happening. Um, I think that's I think that we're good to, is there anything, Greg, that you would like to add to our conversation about strategic planning during crisis?
No, I just want to thank you, Ginny, for the platform,
Yeah.
and for the opportunity to speak. You're doing such phenomenal work with organizations. I've enjoyed following you. I've enjoyed seeing your success with
Oh, thank you, Greg.
organizations. And I think that any opportunity to continue highlighting that phenomenal work is important.
Ah, thank you, Greg. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming.
No problem.